and welcome to Donor Dialogue. Each month, we will bring you a conversation with a community leader about the current state of philanthropy, the donor experience, and insights into the donor and volunteer mindset. I'm Lindsay Blok, Senior Vice President of CCS Fundraising, an executive team member serving in Southern California and across the Southwest. CCS has been a strategic partner with nonprofit organizations for more than 70 years, raising funds, planning and implementing fundraising strategies, and impacting the world through philanthropy. After working with nonprofit organizations for 15 years, I'm particularly fascinated by the donor perspective, how our volunteers view nonprofit organizations and philanthropy, and how we can all work together to improve our communities.
Today, my guest is Dr. Duane Vajgrt. Duane has been involved with Radiant Health Centers as both a volunteer and a major donor since 1985, when it began as AIDS Services Foundation. Duane joined the board in 2005, and since then has become involved in nearly every aspect of Radiant Health Centers, being a member of multiple committees, including the AIDS Walk and the Orange County Ride for AIDS, OCRA, for which he had the distinction of being the top fundraiser in various years for both events. As an Orange County resident since 1975, Duane earned his BS in biology at UCI, attended medical school at UCSF, did his internship at UCLA, and his radiology residency and fellowship at UCI Medical Center. Duane is now a mostly retired board-certified interventional radiologist at UCI Medical Center, where he was a clinical professor in the Department of Radiology, being recognized as one of America's top doctors in 2013. Duane has been affiliated with UCI Medical Center since 1990. Duane, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, it's really a pleasure to be here with you, and just want to take a moment to acknowledge relative to our staff and our CEO at Radiant Health Centers, how much assistance and great attention that we've gotten from CCS, and especially through Claudia, in terms of working with us primarily on our major campaign relative to ultimately becoming a federally qualified health center. And obviously, I'll probably talk a little bit more about that later in our discussion, but just really appreciate the time, energy, and talent that you all bring to us. So thank you for that.
So you've been involved with Radiant Health Center since it began. Can you tell us about how and why you got involved?
Well, my involvement began, as you referenced, in 1985. And at that point in time, me and my friends and community were totally in the throes of the AIDS epidemic. And as it turns out, some very dear friends happened to be building a brand new pool in their backyard. And as part of christening, one of the two guys is very theatrical and involved in sort of the entertainment industry, and put together a little like 9-minute Esther Williams type Aquanet skit around the pool. And as part of it, he asked my husband, Jeff, to be involved in it, because Jeff's very aquatic and pretty talented in that regard. And so they put together this sort of Esther Williams type spoof, which lasted 9 minutes and was very entertaining. And at the time, though, somebody had the very good idea of parlaying that into a fundraiser. And we did that, and it ended up being the seed money for the start of AIDS Services Foundation. And on that little 9-minute skit around the pool, we raised $33,000. Like I said, it was the seed money for the start of it, and then it actually became an annual event, which lasted a total of 23 years, and in which Jeff participated in the first 10 years, and then had a reprise at 15 years, and then at the final 23 years. But at the peak of that, and all this was totally volunteer, everybody donated everything that was involved, building the sets, the materials, their time. And thankfully, with connections through the fellow who originated this, there were the likes of B. Arthur and Whoopi and Rock Hudson and other celebrities who donated various things, including Elizabeth Taylor and Michael Jackson. So at our peak, when it expanded to over being 3 over 3 nights. Originally, it was just one day, but we raised a maximum, I think, one year of $875,000. So it really was totally a community affair and involvement. And so since then, Jeff and myself have been continuous volunteers and donors. And then in 2005, as you referenced, the founding board president approached me about being on the board. And I was still, practicing at the time, so I was a little bit reluctant in terms of my time availability. But out of the experience of that, Jeff and I had a college era friend who we had been housemates with for about 3 years. And he turned out to have moved up to San Francisco. And we lost track of him or didn't get a chance to visit for a couple of years. But when we finally did, we actually found him in the throes of full-blown AIDS, to the point where he had lost his job. He's basically living alone. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, hadn't really accessed any care, didn't seem to have any support system. And so knowing his parents, which we did well from having they lived in Newport Beach. And after we came back immediately from that trip and met with them and told them what was up with our friend John. And to our utter amazement, they basically just totally divorced themselves from him. And so the only recourse that we felt was a viable option was to actually have him come live with us. We're a bit reluctant because I was in the middle of my radiology residency and Jeff had a full-time company that he ran. And so it was only with all the care that we were able to get from AIDS Services Foundation that even became an option. And at the time, ASF was mostly helping people die with dignity and taking care of their immediate needs. Food pantry if they need food support. For those that were more ill, like our friend John, they had nursing assistants that would come out. They had nurse case managers that visited and basically took care of all the support and all the care that allowed us to actually have John live with us. And then unfortunately, eventually after about 9 months, he got so ill that it just wasn't safe to have him at home any longer. And he had to be transferred to a nursing facility and then unfortunately passed about 3 weeks after that. So for me, it was a matter of paying it back and paying it forward for, all that at the time ASF gave us. Since then, ASF has rebranded itself and become Radiant Health Centers. So you'll hear me mention the two because more people are from our longstanding history in the community are much more familiar with the name AIDS Services Foundation, but slowly are becoming aware of Radiant Health Centers now. So, so a long, involved process. But one that I feel very, passionate about. So,
and involvement at every level, everything from making use of services to, being a founding member essentially to volunteering, and now of course, on the board as well.
And then too, in 2005 began my board membership, and I'm actually still on the board. For 3 years, I was actually the board president. And as part of that process, actually, to familiarize myself even more with the workings of our agency, I either sat in on or joined as many of the committees as I could. And as the most important of those at the time, aside from finance, which unfortunately I don't have any familiarity or background with. So, but I joined the governance committee and the fund development committee, and also our programs committee, which then deals with the programs and services we provide. And as a physician, even though I'm not a primary care type physician as an interventional radiologist, but had enough background that it just sort of made sense that I, serve on that committee as well. So
that's a lot of time and energy. What drives you to dedicate that much time and energy to all those various committees and as well as being on the board?
Again, just that feeling like I need to really give back for all that they gave us. And then the other part of it too is just recognizing that there is such a need out there. Because one thing that became evident to us in terms of ending the AIDS epidemic, that although we felt that we were especially effective in terms of all of our testing and the services that we provided, that we were lacking being able to give direct medical services to our client, because ultimately we have decided our end goal now is to become a one-stop shop. And as part of that is to become what's called an FQHC, a federally qualified health center. And it takes a lot to qualify to become one. And we can either become what's called an FQHC lookalike or actually become out of the gate an FQHC. But for the latter, it requires the government putting out, in essence, the opportunity to become that. So slowly but surely, we're taking sort of baby steps to get there. And the reason being is that what we really recognized is that there is such a healthcare disparity among the LGBTQ plus community that if we were going to effectively combat AIDS, we also needed to combat that as well. So as part of our increased vision and mission, we've expanded to providing healthcare to the greater LGBTQ plus community. And so eventually we will become that total one-stop shop, and that's the goal. So.
Wow. And that's a huge change. You've been on the board for some very major shifts for Radiant Health Centers, right? Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like being part of the leadership team as you grappled with some of these changes and thought about some of these changes?
Well, I mean, my hat's off, and I really have to give a huge amount of credit to our CEO, Phil Yeager, because he was always very forward thinking and very much always took advantage of attending any national meetings that he could. And compared to a lot of major urban areas like San Francisco, New York, Seattle, Houston, that sort of thing, comparatively, Orange County was sort of small potatoes. But and because we're so spread out and not very dense or consolidated in terms of the way our population lives here, that we're sort of different than compared to a lot of those more strictly urban areas. But Phil saw what was starting to take place at those meetings and the discussion about even rebranding, which sort of helped promote us to go ahead and take that very bold move, because what was being appreciated was that almost the word AIDS was almost in every AIDS organization. It only sort of made sense. But despite all the years that we've been fighting AIDS, there's still just a huge amount of discrimination and that takes place with that. And so after surveying some of our clients and major stakeholders, people saw the wisdom in actually rebranding to a name that did not include the AIDS, the word AIDS. So, and then the other part of it was that to remain viable as an AIDS service organization, the trend was also happening that they were expanding into broader LGBT care as a way of becoming self-sustaining. And through this FQHC mechanism, that would allow us to do that. So it was a very bold move. Anytime you rebrand, it's not easy, it's not difficult, or I'm sorry, it is difficult from the point of view of it's a change. Most people don't like change. And it's just, but we felt that it was really necessary. And in the feedback that we've gotten since having done so, most people get it. Unfortunately, along the way, we've probably lost a few donors here and there that didn't necessarily agree with our vision, but the vast majority I felt have, and I feel 100% comfortable that we truly made the right decision in that regard. And like I said, a lot of that goes to the strong board that we had at the time that I feel, saw the vision and realized that that was a need that we needed to meet. So.
Now, were you always 100% on board with that shift, or did it take some convincing?
because I worked so closely with Phil, and again, that's one of the keys you mentioned in terms of leadership, is just, I think that's a key element, is the communication. So as the board president and part of the executive committee, again, which I felt very blessed to have such other strong board members at my side and supporting, me as board president, because it truly takes a team, in my opinion. And we all have different strengths, and it's important to surround yourselves by people smarter than you, is always sort of the way that I've approached things in that regard. And so it didn't take a whole lot from us. And in retrospect, I know there are things that we probably could have done to actually smooth that transition even a bit better. And to that end, probably communication is the one biggest thing. So to really try to keep your major donors and major stakeholders involved in that process. So,
well, you and Phil seem to have a very close relationship. When we met to prepare for this conversation, you and Phil were going back and forth, and it was great to see that relationship between you two. What does that really look like, with Phil's role as the executive director and CEO and your role as a board member?
Well, one, and in that just preliminary conversation we had, I was actually sort of pleased and heartened to hear Phil's bringing up an example of where I probably got just a slightly bit testy, and was in terms of taking a stand, that I felt that Phil had potentially exerted more influences as the CEO in a decision about, or a stance on a certain topic. And it was one of the rare times that there was probably any sense of any discord between the two of us. But the important part of it was that he acknowledged that just out of the longstanding relationship that we've had, the communication that we've had, and definitely the respect that we feel for one another, that he took it in stride and stepped back a bit and realized, yeah, that was a legitimate concern or criticism. So again, I think one of the key messages about the success of any organization is hinged around communication, both internally and then what you put out, to the public. So.
Right. Well, and I would assume with that kind of communication, there's every once in a while going to be some bumps in the road, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
Are you and Phil typically always on the same page? Do you have a healthy debate? What does that communication style look like for the two of you?
Well, during the time that I was actually actively board president, we would frequently have communications, and he would reach out to me, I would reach out to him if there was, any question. We took the approach, because it's very important to us as a board, and especially as a board chairman at the time, but just really wanting to maintain transparency with the rest of the board. But the way that the approach that I took is that primarily I would vet major issues, major concerns with Phil and our executive committee, which was, of course, made up of our board officers, and sort of vet the process first, hash out as many pros and cons so that we felt like we saw all sides of the issue, before then bringing it to the board to then have, a robust, discussion with them, with the hope that then everybody else was on board. But then also recognizing, as you sort of alluded, that everybody's going to have a different take and a bit of a different appearance or appreciation for an issue. And so that we also really tried to foster respect among us fellow board members in terms of different ideas, different opinions. But ultimately, and really with rare exception, we've really almost had 100% consensus on any major move that we've made with our board. So we do foster the discussion. Thankfully, I guess we seem to be similarly enough and like-minded enough that we pretty much come to the same conclusion. But it is after some discussion. And the other thing that we really try to foster, and that was facilitated for us in a significant way in terms of us having the years ago, and I frequently lose track of time, but I think it's been a good 10 years now, if not longer, that we actually made a really good choice in terms of hiring a board coach. And Marlene has worked with us closely as a board. She attends all board meetings. And then she also then during the week, in follow-up to the things that were discussed at board meetings and actually meeting with Phil weekly, discusses things with him as part of making us more strategic, doing best practices. So she's really helped us to up our game, as it were. And and as part of that, she really made us understand the importance of succession planning with regard to, our board and the board officers. And so that has also really helped from the point of view that we have smooth transitions from, one leader to the next. And then we implemented as part of the executive committee, we've had the immediate past president stay on in the context of the immediate past president, because there's a lot of institutional memory and history there. And of course, having been in that position just immediately prior, have a lot of wisdom and can be very helpful to the incoming board president. And in that regard, I've had really fine people precede me and follow me. And again, it's just been very helpful and to be part of a supportive team.
Well, Duane and I had so much to talk about that we've decided to split this episode of Donor Dialogue into 2 parts. Join us again next week as we conclude our conversation with Dr. Duane Vajgrt.